And we welcome you in for another weekly take on our look at the Miami Heat and the NBA. A little early this week because of travel with the Heat's travel schedule going down the stretch. So we're reaching you this week at 9 a.m. on Tuesday. Typically, we go 9 a.m. on Wednesday. Try to get back to that schedule when we can. I'm Ira Winderman from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. Up here today in Toronto getting ready for Heat Raptors. He's Kurt Helin from NBCSports.com, Pro Basketball Talk, based in the Los Angeles area. Going to go around the NBA today. Going to go around the Miami Heat situation. We'll see if you're thinking glass half full or glass half empty. And we're going to talk about the NBA as a whole also, where this league is headed now less than 2 weeks in this never-ending season before we get to the playoffs. I have no idea why my camera is this color in this hotel room, but it's like I feel like it looks more like I'm on Mars than somewhere, but we'll work through that for now. Kurt, first of all, do you sense that we have a feeling of where the NBA stands right now 2 weeks before the playoffs? In other words, do you feel there's a clear delineation? And I guess I'll take it even a step further, Kurt. Do you feel you can tell me definitively, I, Kurt Helin, who writes stories a gazillion times a day, now feel that one of these X teams will be the NBA champion? And the reason I'm asking this is the complete counter to that is what we've seen in the NCAA tournament with this one-and-done format. No one had these four teams in the Final Four. Certainly not San Diego State, certainly not Florida Atlantic Owls here in Boca Raton. Kurt, has the NBA reached the point right now where we sort of know where this is trending and we've really, I guess you could say, filtered out the pretenders from the contenders?
Sort of. I think the champion's coming out of the East. And if I could say the top three teams in the East, if you give me Philadelphia, Miami, and Milwaukee, I'd say that's 65, 70% chance that one of those three ends up like the champion. Somebody's got to come out of the West, and I got no idea who that's going to be. Like, I wrote this morning, like, Minnesota looks good the last 2 weeks, and suddenly you're like, did they go on a run? Like
Karl Anthony Towns, they're not the team they've been for the last 60 games. Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's like, I don't know who's coming out of there. And once you get to the finals, as Toronto showed us against the Warriors, like, you got a puncher's chance. Like, if you get there, stuff happens, right? But in just winning the championship, I got a feeling it's coming out of the East. I still think the four best teams are out of the East. If Miami were out West, I'd be like, maybe. Like, I could make the same argument that I'm going to make for Golden State or anybody else over there.
Well, is anyone but the Bucks or the Celtics winning the East? Do you still look at Philadelphia as a big three? You mentioned four teams. Do you have Cleveland in that group also? Which of these teams in the East do you see as the superpowers?
Milwaukee and Boston. I think Philadelphia's got a chance about, like we have talked about, you got to overcome the James Harden experience in the playoffs. Like, he has to show up. Doc Rivers has his own history of playoff meltdowns, despite the ring. The other thing is, push comes to shove against those other two teams. If you're going to start Maxey and Harden in the backcourt, I think I can attack you. Like, I don't like, and I think Miami's in the same boat. Like, if you get Philly in the first round, you're like, I can go at those guys. If that's the 6-3 matchup, at least you've got a place to target, and that makes it possible. So I'm a little more down on Philly, but I still think they're the third best team in the league. I still think they're Cleveland. I think there's a step back, and we've talked about it. Like, Ira, do we trust them in the playoffs yet?
Do we trust them in the playoffs? Based on their history, no. And I know it's been a bunch of different coaches. It's been Brett Brown. Now it's Doc Rivers. But a stat that every year I look at, and I still find somewhat astounding, is that Joel Embiid in his career with the Philadelphia 76ers has never advanced to the conference finals. Now, we know about the shot that Kawhi hit from the corner that advanced Toronto in the season that the Raptors won the championship. But I still find it hard to believe a player as dominant as him, surrounded by a bunch of really good players, whether it's Jimmy Butler. Yeah. Look, say what you want about Tobias Harris. Now James Harden the last 2 seasons. Maxey, the way they drafted him. They've always had talent there. So I find that sort of hard to believe. We've seen a variety of teams in the West get to the conference finals. We haven't seen the Sixers. So I think this is a make or break postseason for them. The way it's shaping up for the Miami Heat right now, they're in 7th place, tied for 6th, but don't have the tiebreaker against the Brooklyn Nets. They're talking potential play-in scenarios. So, Kurt, we've talked about the top tier now. Yeah. We probably have the in some order. The Bucks, the Celtics, the 76ers in one tier. Let's call it tier A. I think there's a delineation now of tier B, at least.
Yeah.
Cleveland and New York. You'd agree with that?
They're going to be 4 or 5 in whatever order. Yeah.
4 or 5 in whatever order. That looks like an opening series. That, to me, could have 7 games written all over it. I don't necessarily know there would be a favorite right now to me that I would say, hey, definitively this team. I think Cleveland's more talented. I think the Knicks have the coaching and the grit. They have, sort of the aura about being the Knicks. If you were to tell me right now, Kurt, and we're going to do this exercise in our redrecover.com Inside the Paint shows throughout coming days and weeks and into the playoffs. But if I were to tell you the Knicks are playing the Cavaliers in the first round, if you had to give me a very premature, don't post this yet on ProBasketballTalk.com prediction, how would you see that kind of series going?
I'd probably take the Cavaliers, but like you said, I think it's a 7-game series. I think that the Knicks with Jalen Brunson back and the way Julius Randle's playing have a chance. End of the day, like you said, better defense in Cleveland, and who's got the best player is, with all due respect to Jalen Brunson and everybody, it's Donovan Mitchell. Donovan Mitchell's still the best player, and he's got a proven playoff track record. So I'll take Cleveland, but I think they get pushed. I don't want to see the Knicks in the first round.
I still see Cleveland as a glad to be here team, the very kind of team you want to get in the first round, because honestly, I can see Cleveland losing a first round series and going, but hey, we got a couple of playoff victories. We haven't had that without LeBron in 25 years. It's a step forward. So I do see it as a glad to be their team. By the way, folks, feel free to join us on our YouTube chat board. It does work here for me north of the border. We'll get to all your comments also. I want to make this as interactive as possible. Bam DPOY says, things got quiet when they thought Big O was talking about smuggling across the border. Yeah, I'm seeing away. Big O will be back at the top of the hour with more illegal drug talk north and south of the border. Or you can just DM Kurt if you want. Daniel says the Bucks seem to be the favorite to win it all. They've been consistent and don't have many weaknesses. And they also have the Greek freak, of course, Giannis Antetokounmpo. Kurt, to answer Daniel's question here on the YouTube chat board, do you see the Bucks as a clear championship favorite, or is Daniel maybe overstating a little?
They've been most consistent during the regular season. I don't know. Boston was the number 1 seed in the East for most of the season, a long time. I'll tell you, they're just a different team when Robert Williams III plays. Like when he's out there on the floor and gives them that defense and rebounding inside, they are a very different team. And you saw it, he came back and they smacked the Kings around, like the best offense in the NBA. And they're like, nah, not tonight. Now, granted, it was 5-7 for the Kings, and there's always other factors, which makes extrapolating from regular season games hard, but they're just better. They're just better when he's back. And so if they're back, I think if that's the Eastern Conference Finals, that's actually your NBA championship series.
And Remy chimes in here. Remy LeBeau, the Bucks have 3 former Heat players, so let's go Bucks. Of course, we saw Goran Dragic get his chance last night as Drew Holiday sat out also. So you got him. Of course, we know that you also have Jay Crowder. So they have shown that they've been willing to add veteran, proven playoff depth also, which is something I think, Boston's roster, I know a lot of people are talking about Malcolm Brogdon as a 6th Man of the Year award contender, maybe even the front runner at this point. But maybe you disagree. I think Boston is just because of the way they're built, totally reliant on Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, to a degree, Marcus Smart and other people's support. Do you look at Boston's depth? Not that depth is the be-all, end-all, mind you, in the playoffs, but do you think Boston's depth is there where it needs to be, Kurt Helin?
You're right, first off, that it's got to be Brown and Tatum, right? But if you're going to try elite two-way wing play has been going back to Jordan, one of the keys to win the rings. It's why Kawhi Leonard is so valuable. It's why, Jimmy Butler is so valuable. So they rely on him, but that's not a bad play. I don't think their depth is that bad, but it's not I don't know if it's as trusted as Milwaukee's done it before. I know Connaughton can do it. DiVincenzo and when you get to Brogdon, when you get to everybody in Boston, they made the conference finals last year and added Brogdon. So in theory, but I guess there is another level for them to be tested at. So
Yeah, and again, the little pieces Boston has done, the Derek White last year,
White, yeah, I mean,
for Josh Richardson, just the little incremental moves, you can see how they make a difference there. So feel free to chime in on your thoughts and everything. I wanted to discuss in this segment, again, Daniel chiming in here, the Cavaliers are scary. They have talent, they have size, they have athleticism, and that their age and their youth can help in the playoffs. I agree. The Cavaliers are a nice team. I think they're a next team. I think down the road, we'll talk more about Cleveland when they maybe pass Philadelphia, depending what happens in the offseason, get closer to Boston, closer to Milwaukee. What I wanted to do in this first segment here today with Kurt is, if the Heat are to be a play-in team, no guarantees, only 7 games left. The Nets have the tiebreaker and a cake schedule coming down the stretch. 2 against the Pistons, 1 against the Rockets. That's 3 wins right there with the remaining 7. So if they go 4-3, right there, the Heat would have to go 5-2, makes it tougher. If the Heat get into the play-in round, it's really interesting, Kurt, when you look at the NBA standings right below the Miami Heat and where they stand as far as not only who they might play in the first round of the play-in, but how it might play out deeper into the play-in. Right now, you have behind the Heat, the Atlanta Hawks, the Toronto Raptors, and the Chicago Bulls separated by a single game. All 3 are possible Heat first game play-in opponents, or if the Heat lose, second game play-in opponents. So I want to focus on matchups there. But first, I want to get your thought, Kurt, on this. The Washington Wizards right now have dropped 3 full games behind number 10, behind the Chicago Bulls. The Indiana Pacers are now 3.5 games behind. Again, most teams have 7, 8 games max left. Kurt Helin, do you see the Wizards or the Pacers showing anything that makes you think, hey, they still might have a chance to get into the play-in and be a possible Heat opponent?
No, the Pacers last night, no Turner, no Halliburton. Beal has missed games. They've shut Kuzma down a little bit. I think both of those teams are reining it in. They realize what's going on, so they're just going to play their kids. I don't know if they're officially going to shut down Beal, but is it just me, Ira? I would be shocked if I saw him the rest of the season.
I think you might see him at home games. I think there's still a certain allegiance to home fans where some of these teams, the way they play it out is they're still selling tickets. There's still, I think, a degree of obligation. Now, if Bradley Beal goes off and you're in danger, which sounds kind of weird, Kurt, of winning, I think you finagle things or whatever. And, of course, you just play more wherever he is these days, the universal donor of Ish Smith, to try to even things out and go in that direction. But, yeah, I do think the Eastern Conference play-in round, in some form, at least the last 3 teams. You don't know if the top it's going to be the Nets or the Heat. Right now, the Heat and the Nets are 11 games out of first, to show 14 games out of first. The Hawks are 17 games out, as are the Raptors. The Bulls are 18. So, in other words, the Heat have a 3-game gap on the Hawks, plus the tiebreaker, because they won the season series 3-1. So I think they'd be pretty safe in number 7. To review how the play-in works, on Tuesday, April 11th, 2 days after the regular season ends, the number 7 and number 18 play for the right to be the number 7 seed in the playoffs. Winner advances, is done. Playoffs start the following weekend, the 15th or 16th. If you lose the first play-in game, number 7 hosting number 8, the winner of that game hosts the winner of number 9 and 10. Number 9 and 10 play on the 12th, the Wednesday after the end of the regular season. Those teams then meet on that Friday. So you have 2 chances. So in some form, if the Heat are in the play-in, they're going to open against the Hawks, the Raptors, or the Bulls, almost certainly at Miami-Dade Arena or whatever it's called then. Kurt, I know I'm putting you on the spot because I know the tiebreakers and you don't. But, hey, you know what? We talk for an hour. We'll figure it out. If you're the Miami Heat, knowing what you know from a national perspective about the Atlanta Hawks, Toronto Raptors, and Chicago Bulls, without saying it publicly, in other words, Eric Spoelstra wouldn't say it publicly, but who would you prefer to see being the Miami Heat of those 3 teams in the first play-in game, knowing you win that game, you're in the playoffs?
It's a good question, and I'm leaning. You've seen the Raptors up close a little more recently than I have. I'm kind of curious how they're playing. Atlanta, look, here's the problem. The Bulls are actually playing good basketball. Yeah. I think I would take Chicago off the list. I don't want to see them. They, since the All-Star break, have played good defense. Zach LaVine has gone off. Patrick Beverley's just been the kind of slap in the face they needed, which is a crazy thing to say. They've been good. So I don't really want to see them. I'd rather see Atlanta, Toronto, and probably Atlanta, unless Toronto, like, again, you've seen them more recently. Atlanta scares you just because they've got Trey and they've got DeJounte Murray. Like, they have the one game capability, but I don't really trust them, where I think the Raptors are the better team, but maybe not able to hit the same, like their peak isn't necessarily as high. I mean, they do have Pascal Siakam, but I guess you'll get a look at them tonight. Are they playing everybody?
They are playing everybody today. There is Gary Trent Jr., an injury situation. He's questionable, so I don't know if he'll play. The rest of the roster looks like it'll be there. Ever since they got Jacob Poeltl at the trade deadline, they finally have a center rotation, so they're not literally Chris Boucher to get today, Precious Achiuwa tomorrow, sort of rotating all their centers, so they have a sense of who they are. So now I'm going to sort of fill you in, because I know our Heat listeners down in South Florida are aware. The Heat finished the season 3-1 against the Hawks. The Heat right now are 1-2 against Toronto, are underdogs here against the Raptors at Scotiabank Arena, could finish conceivably 1-3 against Toronto. The Heat are 0-3 against the Bulls with that season series being over. We can say the regular season doesn't matter. You tighten your rotation in the playoffs, you're all in, you're not resting Kyle Lowry for the next game or something like that. Kurt, do you think regular season records do weigh in the heads of teams? If, let's say it's Miami Heat against the Chicago Bulls. Do you think the Heat say to themselves, oh man, we're 0-3 against them, they have our number? Or do you think NBA players, as they are wont to do, shove the regular season aside and are more carefree about that?
I think they're a little more carefree about that. I think they see it as, well, remember that was the game where second night of a back-to-back, or we were on this trip, or whatever was going on. We were without some players. So they're able to put it aside. I think the concern is, like, when it's 3-0, are there just matchup issues, right? Like, some teams just are bad matchups for other teams. Even, hey, Miami's the better team this season, but the Bulls are a tough matchup. I think that sticks in their head a little bit, like, hey, we didn't really have an answer for Zach LaVine or whatever goes off in those games. So, I think that matters. I think that you'd look at hey, we beat the Hawks 3 out of 4 times. Like, you'd have that in your head. Like, we got these guys.
And the Hawks would have that in the head. And the Hawks would be on the road.
Yeah.
And a team like that in the play-in, knowing that if you lose the first play-in game, you go back home and host the second play-in game, might have a little bit more of a defeatist and will take care of it down the road type of mentality. So if I had to line up the teams, I would rather play the Hawks in the first round for this reason. They know they're a team in transition. They hired their coach late in the season, Quinn Snyder. They're going to reformulate and recalibrate the entire thing, whether John Collins is back, what type of role Trae Young is going to have, what are they going to do with DeAndre Hunter as far as a featured player. They would be my number one choice. My number two choice probably would be the Bulls, because it'll be the Bulls on the road, and I think that'll be a little different dynamic than playing the Bulls in the United Center. Toronto's history with the Heat is every game goes overtime. Nick Nurse was talking about that yesterday at the Raptors practice, that for some reason that's where we wind up. So if I were to line up the Heat's choices in the play-in, and they do not want to be in the play-in for the very reasons we've said, I think the Hawks would be their first choice. I think the Bulls would be their second choice, and then the Raptors. It's a tough field. I know that you're going to tell me the West has a tough field also, but I think that's why the Miami Heat, if they can, and they haven't shown the ability to do it yet, sort of need to win out. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. That's our first segment on redrecover.com Inside the Paint. If you missed any part of it, you can catch it on our Big O Show podcast outlets. After this break, I want to talk to Kurt about players who we convinced ourselves never would be traded because they're loyal or faces of the franchise. But now all of a sudden, Pat Riley and that big old harpoon of his, even at age 78, is Ahab going back out there? Might there be a Beal or a Lillard, or dare I say it, a Doncic as a possibility for the Miami Heat? Kurt Helin will give us the exact precise answers about that and more after this break on redrecover.com Inside the Paint. And we welcome you back for our second segment of redrecover.com Inside the Paint. We're coming to you Tuesday this week because of the Heat travel schedule. I'll be off from Toronto. If I get through customs, on the way to New York for a game tomorrow. The Heat tonight are here in Toronto playing the Raptors. Tomorrow night, a key sort of last chance for number 5 showdown with the New York Knicks at Madison Square Garden. The Heat win that game, they will get the playoff tiebreaker by virtue of division championship. No, it sounds a little odd. We'll discuss that in our third segment. If you missed the first segment, go to any Big O Show podcast outlets. You can listen to that there. Smash like buttons along the way. Myra Winderman from the South Florida Sun Sentinel here in Toronto. He's Kurt Helin from Pro Basketball Talk, NBCSports.com out in the Los Angeles area. In our first segment, we talked about the Heat, the play-in, possible preferred opponents, possible non-preferred opponents. Again, I'm keeping an eye on the chat board here today. Daniel says the main threats for the Heat and the play-in are the Raptors and the Bulls. I think Kurt and I both agree with that. Daniel goes, I'm not too worried about the Hawks. They're such an up-and-down team that I could see that. Bam DPOY says, is Cody Zeller back yet? We've reached that point, Kurt, down here, wondering if Cody Zeller can salvage this thing. Yes, he is no longer on the Heat injury report. By league rule, if you're not in the injury report, you have to be available. Whether he plays, whether he doesn't play, we will see. So we'll sort of figure that out. Remy chimes back in. So ironic that Precious Achiuwa would have been the perfect fit for Miami. Not sure for that because he hasn't really been, Remy, the perfect fit for Toronto. So we'll see that. Remy then also brings up, here's another name. Pat Riley is sharpening that whale harpoon for Jaylen Brown, actually. That brings us full circle to what I want to talk about. Kurt, you know this because, as we know, the offseason in the NBA is the main season. People love rumors. People love speculation. Yeah. People love trades. People love free agency. For months, really for years, honestly, Kurt, we've spoken about Bradley Beal and Damian Lillard and whether they would say enough is enough. For months and honestly years, Kurt Helin, Damian Lillard and Bradley Beal in no uncertain terms, whether it's their words or how they approach their contracts, have said, this is the team that drafted me. This is where I've raised my family. This is where I'm going to start my career and end my career. And then this season happened. And now Toronto is playing 5 guys in their lineup you've never heard of. They're actually using a bunch of ushers up there at the Motor Center as their reserves. They are giving into the lottery. The Wizards, maybe not as much by choice, maybe the level of the competition in the East having stepped up, they realized that they weren't good enough, but they've essentially capitulated. No less than both John Hollinger and David Aldridge, the Athletic, said it's time for the Wizards to tank, to move toward a draft choice. Kurt Helin, you have written countless pieces at Pro Basketball Talk about Lillard trade and non-trade possibilities, about Beal trade and non-trade possibilities. Has your thinking on this changed?
Not too much, in the sense that the bottom line is, for both of those franchises, they're not moving them unless Beal and Lillard ask out. Like, this is not the – even though you and I, Ira, and everybody on the chat board, we can make a case for, hey, you should do this now. You're not going to win with them. If you should start the rebuilding while there's value in their value isn't necessarily going to go up in a trade. They're just not going to do it. Their ownership isn't going to do it unless those guys come forward. And so that's always been the scenario. And I'll still to this day feel it's a little more likely with Beal than Lillard, at least in the short term, but we'll see. I mean, Lillard was pretty frustrated. This is now 2 years in a row they haven't made the playoffs.
You know, and I agree with the line of thought. There is no way after someone is that loyal, you as a franchise can turn your back on the player. But I do wonder, Kurt, Damian Lillard gave a beautiful interview on this. And he said, people forget that my family is here, that I have roots in the community, that I enjoy waking up and going to bed where I live right now, that this has become home for me. I get all that. That runs counter to what we hear from the biggest egos in the sports: championship, championship, championship. I guess this is a tough way to phrase it. Is that almost a character flaw in either of them?
Yeah.
That it's not championship. Look, Michael Jordan was cutthroat for championships. You'd agree with that.
Oh, LeBron James, absolutely.
LeBron James would change teams on a dime if he thought there was greener championship grass. Hell, he turned his back on Dwayne Wade to go somewhere where he thought Kevin Love and Kyrie Irving were better for him. Then he turned his back on his hometown when he thought the Lakers might have more for him. And yet you look at Lillard and you look at Beal, Are they just wired differently, or is that wiring starting to change a little bit?
See, I think that's the big question: have they reached the? Hey, look, they're both locked into now massive contracts. They're getting paid, right, through their. I mean,
Right,
Lillard
in the
makes
$40
Lillard
million
makes more,
range.
Lillard
And
makes,
when you get
the
when you
last
get
year
to
Lillard
40,
was more than 60.
and when you get to that $40 million range, you're talking about basically about earning $500,000 a game. So they're taken care of. They are
Yeah.
totally set.
I think they don't. You think that they've both reached? I think they question it more. Let's put it that way. Like 5 years ago, they were like, "No, I'm staying. We can make it work here." And now they both see the end of their careers coming. Like they can see that horizon and go, "I don't think we're on a path that gets me there. Do I need to get on? Do I need to do that?" I think they're questioning it more. Beal in particular, I think, has been more hesitant the last couple of off seasons than Lillard at least bought into what they were selling. I don't know if he still is.
Yeah, and that's the point I want to make is when I look at the Wizards, I see how if I'm Bradley Beal, I can say to myself, at least say to myself, and you know how this works, Kurt. I can give you groupings of players, and you could say there's talent there, but sometimes it just doesn't work. So I could certainly sell myself if I'm Bradley Beal and saying, wait a minute, I have Kyle Kuzma if we bring him back. We have Kristaps Porzingis. We have a nice little core there. You know, those are names. Those are known quantities. I don't know if they've won anywhere, really, obviously, exception of Kuzma, but at least you have a feeling of what they might be. So I get a little bit of that they could think that they have enough there. When I look at the Blazers, and you're much more in touch out in the West Coast with the Blazers, what do the Blazers have? I like Anthony Simons. Yeah. He's a nice player. I'm not guaranteeing he's going to be an all-star. Nurkic is a nice player, but he's not Jokic. That's why they traded him away and moved to the Jokic direction. What do the Blazers have to sell Damian Lillard when it comes to any chance of winning?
They're talking about whoever's next. Look, first off, if you like Nurkic, you can have him. He's available. Right. What they're selling Lillard, and I've been told this by people familiar with their thinking, is, hey, here's what we're going to do. Whoever becomes available this summer, we're talking about Beal and Lillard. There will be others. There are always others. Their argument is we're going to go in there and say, we've got all our draft picks, or most of them. We've got Shaedon Sharpe, who's looked good lately. We've got Anthony Simons. We want to get in on whatever. They are going to take one more swing at a star, and they're going to have to trade for them because stars aren't flocking to Portland. Right. That's what they're selling Lillard. Now, when that strikes out and they go into next season with hey, Jeremy Grant's back. We'll see how Lillard feels, but I can tell you that's what they're selling him. At some point, does he stop buying it?
Right. It's not a lot to be sold. So I just sort of am curious, unless he just sold on, hey, I want to be one of those guys who's associated with a single team my entire career. Usually those guys who want to be associated with a single team their career want to be associated because their teams won. So they were already associated with championships. So you can understand that a little bit more, like Kobe was. The other name, and I floated this to Big O, and Big O basically thinks he's basically this player just an out of shape laggard who's going to eat his way out of the NBA. I don't see that. That was Big O's take yesterday on our accurate Pembroke Pines report. Luka Doncic is under contract till 2025. Luka Doncic, I believe, has been done dirty by the Mavericks with their awful decision to simply let Jalen Brunson walk into the ether and go to the Knicks for nothing in return. Then they trade for Kyrie Irving, and they trade their entire depth. So there's nothing surrounding those players. Now, I know you can't do anything right away, but Kurt Helin, you'll remember, Paul George forced his way out of Indiana with 2 years left on his contract. It's usually always the season before you start turning the screws. But if you're talking with 2 years left on your contract, Luke is getting to that point also.
Yeah,
has that gotten bad? I've read everywhere, from Pro Basketball Talk and everywhere else, about what's going on in Dallas. Have we reached critical mass there with Luka and Cuban and Dallas and the Mavericks?
He is and I'm not there, but he appears have you ever seen him this frustrated? He's not just with the officials,
with referees, I've seen him as frustrated, but with the situation, no.
No, but with the situation, he has kind of said, look, and apparently there's some off the court issues as well that he's frustrated with it. it sounds like a guy who's looking for his whiteout. I still don't think that's this summer, because you said he signed his extension as well.
Right.
He hits the peak of that thing the summer of 2024. And then the leverage, I think you're right. Even with 2 years and a player option, I think at the end of that left, so 3 years technically, that's when the leverage shifts. That's when hey, I'm not happy. I do think that it's possible. I will tell you that I know that other front offices, I talked to people in other front offices with that circled, like, hey, we're just keeping an eye on that. But I don't know that he has the leverage to force it this summer. But if, like you said, if Kyrie's a free agent, you're either going to have to pay to bring him back it's going to be way more money than you want to spend on Kyrie Irving. How long do you want to be in the Kyrie Irving business? They don't have the assets or trade or otherwise now to go get anyone else. Like, I don't know how you build out that roster. And as they've actually, I looked this up because I was writing about them yesterday. They're actually plus 4.6 per 100 when those two are on the court together. They have no defense. They have nothing else. If those two guys aren't on the floor and playing at a high level together, the Charlotte Hornets outscored them by 22 in the paint, man. They're just not good defensively, and there's no easy remedy to fix it. I think Doncic wanting out is a real thing.
If that's the case, can Mark Cuban salvage that? In other words, I think he stole the Trae Young trade with Atlanta when they swapped picks, and he got Luka. Luka this year, until recently, was a top 5 MVP candidate on that ballot when you list 1 through 5 for the postseason awards. I think with the record, he's not anymore because of the way they've fallen off. But when you look at that in Dallas, when you finally get the icon, when you finally get the international sensation, how do you trade someone like that? How do you save face at all if you're Mark Cuban?
That's the problem. Is I think we've seen this before with Durant, with others, where teams hold on to the point that guy's going to walk and they can't let him go, because if you're Dallas, if you give up on Luka, you're back to square one, right? Like you're
less than square one.
Yeah, exactly. You're back in the draft and hoping for another stroke of luck in the draft. So I don't think Cuban can, from his perspective. Like, he has to figure out how to make this work. I'm just not sure. They're one of those teams sometimes, don't they, Ira, and the Heat are really good about not doing this to themselves. This short-term move after short-term move until they back themselves into a corner, and then they don't really have options. They don't leave themselves out. The best teams have tradable players, and hey, we can move this guy and we can switch this salary around, and suddenly we're not stuck. And Dallas looks like they've kind of painted themselves into a much more stuck corner.
Right. I mean, say what you want about Kyle Lowry, he's an expiring contract. Say you want about Duncan Robinson, he's in a sweet spot of numbers to match. Say what you want about Tyler Hero, but he could still be the leading man in a trade. Say what you want about owing the Oklahoma City Thunder a first-round pick, but the Heat can still put as many as 3 first-round picks into play. So they do have functionality that is so key in that situation. One other one struck me, and this has been walked back a little, but it was out there, at least in the ether for a few days. Yeah. The whole Jaylen Brown might not necessarily be content in Boston. The whole Jaylen Brown wants to be a leading man. And I agree to a degree, always will be in Jason Tatum's shadow, because I believe Jason Tatum's the better player. I think most would there also. But Boston is the Jays. Boston is who they are, as I mentioned in our first segment, because of Brown and because of Tatum. Is Jaylen Brown going to give that up to be the leading man in Houston? I know there's frustration. They're winning. They got to the NBA Finals last year. They've overcome the loss of a coach to go to a rookie neophyte and still are in a good position. It is a team that management has shown with Brad Stevens willing to augment with the Malcolm Brogdons, like we spoke about, with the Derek White. The Jaylen Brown thing. Or is the allure of being a leading man so much and so sexy and so tantalizing and so seductive that Jaylen Brown gets lured in that direction?
I didn't read his comments that way. I took them as hey, you better pay me. Like I am
money. Okay, more money.
I want the max. I want this. He'd have to get the supermax. He'd have to make some all NBA teams. Although that's a discussion for another day about whether he's a guard or a forward and all that crap. But I read that as, don't think you're getting a discount. I want every last penny. And if you pay me, we'll figure something out.
Kurt,
I don't know that, but if they stumble in the playoffs, if they lost to Philadelphia in the second round, is that different now? Does it feel different to them?
How does Boston not pay him? We just spoke about Luka Doncic. It's so hard to get a player like that. You do whatever you have to do to make it work. How does Boston? I think all the leverage is with Jaylen Brown, because you take away either of the Jays, they're a middle of the pack team in the East. Shouldn't Boston, almost through back channels and his agent, said, "Of course you're getting every last dollar"?
Yeah, I would think that was the message. That's how I read it. I read that as a, don't come at this with a, hey, maybe we can get a hometown discount type of thing. Him, because he will be up for an extension. I think it's next year. I think he's got
still has time left. Correct.
A little time left on this deal, but I think it was the, hey, I expect my money comment. But that said, I don't know that. I don't know Jaylen Brown particularly well, but my sense of him is not the ego. I want to be. He would want to go somewhere he felt wanted and comfortable. That wouldn't necessarily be as the alpha, but he would want to win. He would want to be somewhere, like if he felt he could go somewhere and contribute and was wanted. And I think that sometimes that's hard for teams to do with players they already have, is remind them how much they want them. And not sometimes it's more than with the John Hamm Mad Men line. That's what the money is for.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's got to be a little more than that. Yeah.
And I know we're running long here, Sean, so I just have one more piece here, and then we'll go to the break here on RedRecover.com Inside the Paint. The last name I want to get to you is Joel Embiid. He's been mentioned before as being unhappy. He's voiced displeasure. They seem to be in a better place right now. As we mentioned in our first segment here on RedRecover.com Inside the Paint, they have yet to make the conference finals in his tenure. If the Sixers don't advance to the Eastern Conference Finals, which will be tough, beating out either Milwaukee or Boston. If James Harden possibly does up and leave for Houston and the nightlife he prefers, and that team is sort of torn down a little bit apart, Kurt, in the putting percentages on it, in just your general thoughts, Joel Embiid, could his name wind up legitimately being out there this offseason?
Somewhere in the corner of Pat Riley's office and in every other front office is a whiteboard. And in the corner is the names of superstars we were watching, just in case. And these are the guys that are on that list, by the way. Beal, Lillard have been on, like they're in Sharpie at this point, like up on the whiteboard.
Right.
It's not even the erasable kind. Embiid is on that list. I can tell you a couple teams I know of that, like, hey, we're just watching that. We're just watching that because it could be. Like for exactly the scenario you laid out. They get bounced in the first round. Harden's a free agent. He decides to go somewhere else. Houston, there's something to it, whether he leaves or not. We'll see. But like, there's enough there that like you can paint yourself into that scenario. And if I can get a guy who might be the MVP this year, you've got to jump. Miami and a whole bunch of teams would jump at that because and
the Heat in Bam Adebayo at least have a piece they could put into play to make a trade. So, folks, there is not another hour-long show on the interwebs or anywhere on YouTube or anywhere else that is already today, Tuesday morning, before 10 a.m., traded Damian Lillard, Bradley Beal, Luka Doncic, Jaylen Brown, and Joel Embiid. That's why you stay here with us on RedRecover.com Inside the Paint Show and the Big O Show. After this break, we'll get back to a little bit more heat. We'll go back to your YouTube chat board for your comments on that segment. And so we'll wrap it up here. Look ahead at the Heat schedule, what has to happen. Less than 2 weeks left to go in the regular season. All that and more when we come back on RedRecover.com Inside the Paint. And we're back for our third and final segment of this week's Red Recover Inside the Paint. Usually we're on Wednesday. I'm traveling this week. I got to go to Madison Square Garden for a game tomorrow, so I'm going to have to get on the, international flight tomorrow. So we're coming here Tuesday. I'm Ira Winderman from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel here in Toronto. He's Kurt Helin from Pro Basketball Talk, NBCSports.com, out in the Los Angeles area. If you missed our first two segments, in the first segment, we spoke about the NBA playoff race, what's real, what's not. You can catch that on any Big O podcast outlet. Smash the like button. Second segment, we spoke about trade possibilities of a bunch of big names that people thought wouldn't be out there, but were out there. Want to go to the chat board again, like to get everyone involved. That's the case here every week on our hour-long redrecover.com Inside the Paint show. Daniel brought up another name. I haven't heard it as much because the team's been winning a little bit more, but still have a losing record. Zach LaVine. We've heard this name mentioned before. Like everyone else we discussed, Kurt Helin, he got his extension. He's in the big money range. Where does Chicago go? Did they delude themselves into finishing below 500 but making the play-in as being good enough? Did they wait to see how the results play out in the playoffs? What sort of happens, do you think, with Zach LaVine down the road?
This is a case where I think other teams speculate about him a lot. And when I've said something to those other teams, like, well, how real is this? They're like, yeah, they seem to really just believe in this core. Like internally, they still think it's going to work. Maybe this playoffs, maybe this season, in this postseason, changed that dynamic because, other teams have looked at Zach as a possibility. So there's something there, but I don't know if Chicago internally sees that yet in the way some of these other ones do.
Yeah, that's an interesting name. And then Daniel brings up another, and you and I spoke about how Dallas doesn't have a lot of choices, might have to do something that's unpalatable, but he has a reasonable question here. You and I spoke in our last segment about Jaylen Brown as a great player that Boston has to pay because someone absolutely, when the time comes, will offer him the maximum. But Daniel's question here is, what teams are even interested in signing Kyrie Irving long-term? Has Kyrie overplayed his hand? Could there wind up still being a Lakers desperation? Where do you think that plays out? Is there really a Kyrie Irving hunger anymore in the NBA, Kurt Helin?
I haven't heard that much. In fact, I can tell you the Lakers' desperation for him is down, right?
Okay.
But we'll see what happens. Again, we'll see what happens in the playoffs and how everybody feels, and more importantly, what LeBron says later. But
exactly.
I'm curious. I think the question is, like, the problem is the teams with the money to go cap space hunting, that have the cap space to just sign him, Houston, Orlando, San Antonio. He doesn't want to go there. They don't want him. Okay. So the market of teams that would want him, which is, I think, small, and everybody only wants, I think the real question ever is 2 years. Would you even give him a third?
I would go as light and limited as I could on that. But we know the problem is Kyrie is so persnickety, he would almost look at that as a snub. So I really do wonder who he's negotiating against. What is what is Kyrie Irving's leverage?
He doesn't, and it's got to be a sign and trade to, like, the teams he would want to go to, like the Lakers, but also, I mean, like, you'd go to Miami if you want him. You'd go, like, to a lot of teams if you'd take him. If you sign and trade, now you're hard capped. And that messes with some of the places he wants to go where they're trying to spend to win. So I don't know that he might have to re-sign in Dallas just because I don't know that there's a market or other options for him that are viable.
No, I agree. He might have to re-sign and then be miserable. Kurt, you brought up a really interesting point. So I want to put that out there to fans right now also. If you are hard capped over what they call the apron of the salary cap, you cannot acquire a player in a sign and trade. The Miami Heat, because of the Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo, Kyle Lowry, Duncan Robinson, and Tyler Hero extension, are already over next season's apron. Unless they shed salary, they cannot bring in a player in a sign and trade transaction. So you would have to first maneuver your money and then do a sign and trade, which is why the Heat are very limited. Except for trades in the offseason, they'll just have one exception. The taxpayer mid-level, $7 million about, roughly. Again, if we're under the same CBA, that still has to be adjusted. But by today's workplace rules, they couldn't even do that. So even if Kyrie says, you know what? I talked about Miami for years. I want to go there. Let's make it work. Unless the Heat first shed salary, trade Duncan in a draft pick somewhere, trade Kyle Lowry in a draft pick somewhere, they couldn't even do that. The Heat have always been very careful about Kyrie Irving. And I would think asking Eric Spoelstra to manage both Jimmy Butler and Kyrie Irving could very well move Eric Spoelstra to the front office and basically say, just enough is enough. So I am curious about to see how that would play out. Daniel chimes in, I would trade Jimmy Butler for Luka. Again, Dallas is trying to build something there. Getting a 33-year-old player, I'm not sure is exactly the reason to go in that direction. So I think that's interesting. Going into other tangential areas, because they do like to attack the chat board when I can. Remy says, why aren't the Miami Heat playing Victor Oladipo more? I think Victor Oladipo's wild child offensive ways just became a little bit too much for Eric Spoelstra to sort of stomach. And once Kyle Lowry came back, that went away. Again, I think in games that Kyle doesn't play, that you will see the Heat play Victor Oladipo a little bit more. But that sort of brings us full circle, because I want to talk in our last segment here about Miami Heat and about avoiding the play-in and about having to possibly win out. So let's look at the upcoming schedule, something we like to do in our final segment every week on RaidRecover.com, Inside the Paint. Toronto Raptors tonight, playing well as of late, possibly moving up to that number 8 playoff seed in the win and in first play-in round, probably will be held in Miami. Kurt, of the teams that I can't figure out in the NBA, and your Los Angeles Clippers are certainly up there, although we know with injuries and absences have a lot to do with that. If I were to tell you that I had a team that had OG Anunoby, had Pascal Siakam, had Gary Trent Jr., had Fred VanVleet, had this unique center in Chris Boucher with every three-pointer, but is 7 feet also, and has the coaching of Nick Nurse. Kurt Helin, can you explain to me why the Raptors aren't better? Or
no, I really can't. They've shot horribly this year for kind of like the Heat. They had some really terrible shoot, but I don't know. You and I talked about this before the season. I had them in the top 6. I thought they were going to be in the playoffs, not struggling to fight their way through the play-in. I don't have a good answer for this, and I think this is another team where internally I know that I've heard anyway that they love this roster, but do they really? Are they looking at the same thing? So I'm curious.
Well, yeah. But that's the thing is I think you can love that roster because of the possibilities and flexibility. Then you look at a roster and you say, but is there one player who's great enough to be the leading man superstar? I have seen Pascal Siakam play games in the 40s, and I think even once in the 50s, where he has shown that he can be that dominant type of force, which is why I just don't get it. And again, we talk about some, we equal the parts and all of that, and whether the combinations work or not. Masai has not been, shy about having to make dramatic changes. Obviously, he didn't want to lose Kawhi. He was willing to give up on Kyle Lowry. That might have proved prescient, anyway. And he got Precious Achiuwa there also. Are the Toronto Raptors at make or break? Is this critical mass? If the Toronto Raptors do not advance out of the play-in, are you expecting a different Raptors outlook this offseason?
It's a good question. For some reason, I just don't expect them to blow it up, even though, or make those kind of radical moves, even though I kind of think maybe they should. They need to make some kind of change, don't they? Something didn't work this year, and whatever. From the outside, it just doesn't. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what that is, but whether there's been frustration with Nick Nurse, but are you really going to move on from Nick Nurse? I mean, I'm just not sure what direction they go.
Yeah, to me, it's the VanVleet thing. There were points he was playing like one of the best guards in the NBA. So you lose Kawhi Leonard and you're saying, yeah, but Fred's really come along as an offensive threat. We'll be okay. And then you lose Kyle Lowry because you say, you know what? Fred's going to be a point guard. He's going to get this thing in order. He's going to be the next thing. So you move away from Kyle Lowry. And I'm just not sure that they haven't overstated their hand in what they have. To a degree right now, I think Jalen Brunson's the better player than Fred VanVleet, which is not something I would have thought I'd be saying in late March, early April of the 2022-23 season. I think that might be where it starts. So I do wonder what they do with Fred and sort of what the commitment is there also. Again, he could be a dynamic, like you mentioned, three-point shooter who's loading up and makes 4 or 5 in a game. Or it could be a guy who you say, hey, just go ahead and let him shoot. Tonight's game, Miami Heat here, Toronto Raptors. The Heat coming off one of their worst performances of their season, arguably their worst home performance of the season. How do you see this one tonight, Kurt Helin?
I think you get a desperate Heat team for the reasons you said. A, that was we talked about that being almost a must win against Brooklyn. I don't know that they're tied. It's not technically a must win, but that one stung. And you look ahead, which is, I think, what you're going to do next on the schedule. If you're back to back against the Knicks, who get Brunson back tomorrow, by the way,
right?
Like, this is the winnable game, right? This is the easier to win game. Like, I want to target this one and then take my chances tomorrow night.
And that's why it'll be very curious. I'm about to head off to shoot around right now at Scotiabank Arena to ask Eric Spoelstra, is Kyle Lowry at the point he can play both games? Or are you doing what you did in that Chicago-Detroit back-to-back, where you're playing him in one of the two games, holding him out of the other, just trying to get a split, which is a dangerous proposition to play with only 7 games left in the regular season. Yeah. But I can't fathom Kyle Lowry sitting out in Toronto for what this place means to him. So it will be curious if he plays tomorrow again in New York. We know what's happened with Heat Knicks. We saw Julius Randle hit that remarkable shot at Miami-Dade Arena. Yep. The Knicks get that game. We saw the Heat come on with a solid, almost reaffirming victory last Wednesday against the Knicks. So just to fill people in, because it's kind of awkward. If the Heat and Knicks finish tied 2-2, which will require a Heat victory tomorrow at Madison Square Garden, the next tiebreaker is, and these still do count, division championship. And the Miami Heat do. That's the only reason why a division counts. So the Miami Heat, because they will win the Atlantic, because if they don't finish ahead of Atlanta, obviously they'll be losing a crap ton more games, so there won't be a tie with New York, where the Heat would get that tiebreaker. The division championship also can matter in this respect. Even though the Heat are 0-3 against Brooklyn, even though they might be 2-2 if they win tomorrow against New York and finish 5-3 in the aggregate, rather if finish 2-5 in the aggregate, and I know this sounds odd, if the Knicks, the Nets, and the Heat finish tied, 3-way tie, the first tiebreaker there is you lift the division champion out, the Heat would actually get the number 5 seed. So that division does play in at a time when everyone thinks divisions don't matter anymore. I agree with you. I think a split is a logical goal, although it shouldn't be in these two games. The Knicks know they have a lot to play for. The Knicks know they're in that series against Cleveland, but they also had some awkward games recently. They played the Rockets last night, which is like a bye in the schedule. I think they'll be up for that. Finally, we get to Saturday's home game. Easy schedule for the Heat as far as they then have 2 days off Thursday or Friday. Dallas, as of now at 8 p.m. Saturday. I don't know if they're going to move that because of the conflict with the University of Miami Hurricanes televised game that night.
Ooh.
Is Dallas going for it, or might they be in tank mode? Because if their first-round pick is not among the first 10, they're at number 10 right now, it goes to the New York Knicks. Do you think there's a point where Mark Cuban says, hey, this is what I do on Shark Tank every week. I make cost-benefit evaluations. We need the lottery pick. We're not going anywhere. Will Dallas be in it to win it when they arrive at Miami-Dade Arena on Saturday?
That's a great question, because externally, I got a feeling they shouldn't. They should get that top 10 pick. What are they doing? They're fighting to get into the 10 seed? Like that said, with all the frustration in that organization with them and Kyrie and Doncic, I got a feeling they're going to try to win. They're just not very good at it. Like they're just again, you should be able to pound them. Jimmy should get into the paint. It could be a big Bam night. Like, they have no rim bad perimeter defense and no rim protection, which is and that'll be horrific combo.
And that'll be desperate times for the Heat also. They'll have to get that game again. Yeah. The Heat will have 2 days off before that, 2 days off after that. If ever there was a game they could put into focus, is that. We'll have all those answers when we come back next week when I figure out what day works for redrecover.com Inside the Paint. But for now, after we've already had the Heat in this latest hour acquire Bradley Beal, Damian Lillard, Luka Doncic, Zach LaVine, and Jaylen Brown, we're going to throw it back to the Big O Show with Orlando Alzugaray.
This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.